You know, I think we're living in a pretty interesting time when it comes to copyright law, because a lot of the music from the Great American Songbook is coming into the public domain for the first time. And what that means for musicians and composers, arrangers, it means we can do whatever we want to do with that music. And in that spirit, I'm going to take a piece of music by George Gershwin from 1926, Someone to Watch Over Me, and I'm going to subject it to an analysis and also some reharmonization. Now, that will take me 2 videos to do, so this video will be mostly concerned with a complete analysis. The piece of music presents a bit of a dilemma for us because there are a lot of sources of this music. We could be looking at sheet music or lead sheets or fake books, and we'd get a different version of this song, in particular in terms of harmony, for each source that we look at. So what I decided to do was look at one of the earliest sources I could find, which was a piece of sheet music from 1926 in the key of C. And in listening to George Gershwin's recording from 1926, although he records it in the key of E flat, it really is quite similar to what the sheet music is showing. So that's what I'm going to use for the analysis. You know, I had a wise jazz piano teacher at one point who said there really isn't that much difference between music harmony when it comes to music, whether it be classical or jazz. The difference really is in the inflection. So in that spirit, when I do this analysis, I'm going to be borrowing from jazz terminology as well as classical techniques for doing the actual harmonic analysis. I hope you enjoy it. Let's take a look. Let's start by giving it a listen. I'll play it pretty true to the sheet music. Now you notice that the song started with a long and very beautiful introductory verse. I'm going to skip that section for now and move to the main section of the song. Now it's a worthy section to analyze with modulations to E minor and G, but we'll save that for another video. Before we start our harmonic analysis, let's just look at a few general features of the first 8 measures. First, notice that the piece starts with an ascending pentatonic scale here, but also that it starts not on the first beat, but on the second beat. When I hear this at the beginning of the song, it almost sounds like pickup notes that are aiming toward this measure as the first measure of the section of the piece. Of course, that's a matter of opinion, but look, we do have a B flat here and a C7 chord, which looks like a dominant chord in the key of F. That's a rather unusual beginning for the beginning of a song that's in the key of C. This ascending pentatonic scale is balanced by a 4-note motive here in the melody. Eighth, quarter, eighth, half note, descending, and notice how this is sequenced in the next measure, and then again in the next measure, a step down, and even in the next measure, although the rhythm is a little bit straightened out. That melody in its entirety is diatonic. There are no accidentals in the actual melodic note, which is kind of astounding because look at the harmony. It's extremely chromatic. So we have a diatonic melody, which makes it a little bit easier to sing, against an extremely chromatic harmonization. What interests me most about this harmonization is the bass line. Scale degree 1, moving to scale degree 4, and then from here we have a descending chromatic scale that leads us first to the 2 chord, from the F all the way down to the D, and then it balances again by moving up to the 5 chord. Let's take a look at the harmony. When we analyze a piece, the first thing we should do is write a chart of the chords. So these are the chords that fit diatonically into the key of C. And just to be extremely clear, I'm going to use kind of a hybrid way of expressing them with Roman numerals. This is the C major 7 chord, and I'm going to call it a 1 major 7, the triangle meaning major 7. This is D minor 7. I'm going to call it 2 minor 7, the lowercase Roman numeral 2 meaning minor, and a little bit redundant, but the minus 7 again meaning minor 7. E minor 7 is 3 minor 7. F major 7 is 4 major 7. And G7 is 5, 7. A minor 7 is 6 minor 7. And the B half diminished 7 is 7 half diminished 7. And of course goes back to 1. The only chord that is of this quality, that is a dominant chord, is the 5 chord. This has a major triad with a minor 7th. So sometimes people call this a major, minor, 7 chord. And of course the 5 chord always returns us back to 1. We are going to see instances in this piece and in lots of other pieces where a composer uses that quality of a chord on another scale degree. Maybe here, or maybe here, and maybe here. In other words, changes the chord chromatically so that it's a major chord with a minor 7. And we indicate it just put a 7 after it. If that's the case, we'll call that a secondary dominant. And in fact, we see this at the very beginning of Someone to Watch Over Me. Let's take a look. So here we are in the key of C, and the first chord we have is a C. The chords are actually printed up above here. Some of them are accurate, some of them are not. Here, this is a C, E, and a G. That's just a C triad. So that's a 1 chord. But by the time we get here, we in fact do have a C7. That's C, E, G, B flat. Also has an A, which is sort of the 6th of the chord, and we have a few passing tones in here, the D. But this is interesting. This is C, E, G, B flat. That's a chromatic chord, major with a minor 7th. Therefore, it is a secondary dominant. We will say that this is the 5-7 chord. But that's the 5-7 chord in the key of F. In other words, C resolves a perfect 5th down to F. So we'll call it the 5-7 of 4. And of course it goes to the 4 chord, but the top 2 notes are not quite correct. They're not correct until here. This is the F, A, C. Here, this is a B and a D. So sometimes when we're hitting notes that are a little too high and on a strong beat and then they fall into place, we call those Appoggiaturas. So this is a double Appoggiatura. Notice that the chord symbol here says F6, which does accommodate the pitch D here, but not really the pitch B. The next chord is a G sharp diminished 7, but before we talk about that, we're going to have to talk a little bit more fully about diminished 7 chords. Let's return to our chart and notice that the diminished chord actually appears here as the 7th note of the scale, but this is a half diminished chord. So we have a diminished triad with a minor 7th, half diminished. Sometimes composers prefer to change that chord. In other words, they like to write it as B, D, F, A flat. And the reason for that is it creates a completely symmetrical chord built up of all minor thirds. And we call that B fully diminished 7 chord, or a 7 fully diminished 7 chord. Actually, if we were to write this chart in the key of C minor, and we got to the 7th note of the scale, C minor has 3 flats, but we would build it off of the leading tone, B natural, B, D, F, A flat from the key signature. The 7 chord in the key of C minor is already a fully diminished 7th chord, all minor thirds. Composers are quite fond of the symmetric nature of this chord, and they will use it whether in a minor key or in a major key with this alteration. Let me take a look at the structure of a fully diminished 7 chord a little bit more carefully. This is the 7 chord in the key of C, altered just a bit to make it a fully diminished 7 chord. And of course, 7 chords most often resolve up a half step, in this case, to the 1 chord. This is a completely symmetric chord. I'm going to show you that by writing a chromatic scale starting on B. Now I'm going to locate the notes of the chord on this chromatic scale, the B, the D, the F, and the A flat, here spelled as G sharp. Notice that these pitches are all a minor third apart. If I go up another minor third, that is 3 half steps, I get right back to the first note that I started with. Therefore, we can see that we could actually start on any one of these pitches and build a fully diminished 7 chord that comprise of these same notes. For example, I could start on D and build a fully diminished 7 chord, D, F, A flat. I spelled it C flat here so that I could see the minor third interval at the very top, but that pitch is the same as the B pitch here. And this is a D fully diminished 7 chord. The reason why this is important because this would be a 7 diminished chord that would lead not to C, but to E flat. So this will be an important concept in the piece that we're about to look at. Notice I could do that with an F fully diminished 7 chord as well. Here I've spelled it F, A flat, C flat, E double flat, again, so that you can see it all in minor thirds. But enharmonically, it's the same as these pitches. F, A flat, this is a B, the C flat, and this is a D, the E double flat. This would be a good chord that could lead up a half step, perhaps to a G flat. And we'll do it one more time, starting on this pitch. It will actually start on G sharp instead of A flat, because it's a little bit easier to build it off of G sharp. So this is a G sharp fully diminished 7 chord, but I hope that you see that it's the exact same pitches as the original chord. This would be a good chord to lead up a half step to A. Now I'm ready to continue my analysis. Now this says G sharp diminished 7 going to C, and this could very well be a C chord, C, E, G. Notice it also has the pitch A. There may be some advantage to calling this actually a different chord. Watch this. A, C, E, and G makes it an A minor 7 chord, which is the 6th chord, and the chord is in second inversion. In classical theory, we would call that a 6-4-3. You could do it either way, either A minor 7 or a C6, but the reason why A minor 7 might make more sense is because the G sharp fully diminished 7 chord, notice G sharp moves up a half step to the A. So that would make sense actually as a 7 fully diminished 7 chord moving to the 6th chord. Now, the bass pitch is F, which would be the 7th of the chord. In classical harmony, we indicate that with a 2. We'll say that this is a 7 diminished 2 going to 6. Passing tones here. And we go to another fully diminished 7 chord, D sharp fully diminished 7 chord. And notice it's going to 5-7. That's the G7 chord. That's actually in second inversion. So we'll call that a 5-4-3. Now, this perhaps would be better thought of as different chord than a D sharp fully diminished 7 chord. The pitches are D sharp, F sharp, A, and C. But if we were to think of the F sharp as the root and not the D sharp, and call it F sharp, fully diminished 7 chord, then we have a chord that is moving up a half step to the G, as 7 chords do. So then we could call this 7 fully diminished 7. The D sharp is an enharmonically spelled 7th of the chord, so we'll put 2 of 5. 7, fully diminished 7, 2 of 5. Next, we have an A sharp diminished 7 chord. A sharp, C sharp, E, and G. But notice that the next chord is D minor. That's a 2 chord. If we were to think of this as a little bit different, in other words, not the A sharp as the root, but the C sharp as the root, which in fact it is the lowest pitch, C sharp, E, G, B flat, which is enharmonic to the A sharp, then we would say that this is a C sharp, fully diminished 7 chord, and it is a 7 diminished 7 of 2. In other words, C sharp moving up a half step to the D. I'm always looking for a way to think of that diminished 7 chord, if possible, with the root tone resolving a half step up. Because if that's the case, then it's moving just like a 7 chord does, a 7 chord resolving. And we really can think of it that way in all of these diminished chords. The 2 chord, notice in the chord analysis here, it's called an A7 chord, A, C sharp, E, G. There's no C sharp here. You could call it that, or you could just say these are passing tones. Back to the 2 chord in first inversion. We use a little 6 to indicate that in classical harmony. Then, this is called A minor 6th, but A minor 6th, A, C, E, F sharp. If we were to actually spell this with the F sharp as the root, F sharp, A, C, E, we have a half diminished chord. Minor third, major third. This is a half diminished chord. I'm going to call it a 7 half diminished 7, not of the 1 chord, but of the 5 chord. Notice it is resolving a half step up as 7 chords do. This chord is a D minor 7, but the pitch in the bass is G, so we should at least acknowledge that the bass tone is G by putting that in the chord symbol, D minor 7 over G. We can also see that the G7 chord has the 7th, the 9th, and it has the 4th. So watch me write it like this. I'm going to say it's a 5 chord built up to the 7th. Actually, I'm going to call that pitch the 2, moving to 3, and this pitch the 4, moving to 5. These 2 pitches are carried over from the previous chord, the C and the A, almost as if they're suspended, and then they resolve upward. So there's really 2 ways of thinking of this. It's a D minor 7 with the G bass introduced right away, or just as a 5 chord with some non-harmonic tones that resolve stepwise up into the 5 chord. And the 5 chord, of course, resolves to the 1 chord. The next chord is an E7 augmented, and we can also write it as E plus a 7. Now, augmented chords are most often used as dominant chords. So, in this case, we might expect the chord to resolve down a 5th to A, the 6th chord. Of course, here, the chord resolves a half step up to the 4 chord. When dominant chords resolve stepwise up, we call this a deceptive resolution. But also keep in mind that augmented chords are similar to diminished chords in that they are symmetrical structures. The notes of an E augmented triad are identical to the notes of a C augmented triad. And of course, a C dominant chord would resolve quite nicely down a 5th to the following F chord. Of course, with any chromatic harmony, what's most important and what's most interesting is the elegance of the voice leading. And with this chord here, the E augmented 7, we certainly have that. We have the common tone C, which is the augmented 5th of the E7 sharp 5 chord, which is also, of course, in the F chord. And then we have these half steps leading up the E, going up to F, the G sharp, going up to A. And that's what really makes that chord work very well. From there, we just have a 4 chord and then a 5-7 so that we can repeat the A section, which is the same analysis. So I'm going to skip over that until we get toward the end of that A section. And then it's just a little bit different. It ends with a 1 chord. And here we have a C7 with a B flat and an Appoggiatura on A. Remember the dominant 7 chords when written like that resolve a fifth lower. So this is a 5/7 chord of the F chord, which is the 4 chord, moving to the 4 chord, and then moving to the 5 chord. Now the 5 chord's a bit unusual. It's G, B, D. There's no D, but instead there's a C and an A. This almost looks like an F chord up here, F-A-C. It's really an F over G for a chord. If we were going to try to indicate how this works here, we would just indicate that it has a fourth and a second in it, suspended from the previous chord that never really resolves. Now we're off to the B section, which begins right here, starting with a 1 chord on its way to the 4 chord. The first 2 notes of the 4 chord actually have a couple of pitches that don't fit in the 4 chord. We could call them Appoggiaturas, because they are strong note dissonances that resolve to the F chord only here on the second, weaker beat. But I'd like to take a look at those pitches in a little bit more detail. We see a G sharp, a B, and then when Gershwin goes up to the upper pitches, in other words, he's using lower pitches, neighbor tones below the A and the C, and then he uses upper neighbor tones, B and a D. I'm going to add that to this structure, and notice that we have a diminished triad. This is a very specific kind of a diminished triad, and I'd like to take a moment and explain that a bit. So, the notes we saw at the very beginning of the B section included an F in the bass, and then Gershwin used a G sharp and a B. And a little later on, he includes the D. As I said, that looks like a diminished chord. The G sharp, B, D, and if we include the bass, F, a fully diminished 7th chord. But what's interesting about it is that it's purely decorative. It's being used as a set of neighbor tones, or decorative pitches, to the F chord. Notice the G sharp is a neighbor to the A, and the B and the D are both neighbors to the C. The F pitch is what glues it all together because that's a common tone. For that reason, we call this a common tone diminished 7th chord. Just another use of a diminished 7th chord where it's purely the voice leading that makes it all work. So back to our analysis, let's just go ahead and acknowledge that this is a common tone. I call it CT, diminished 7 chord, off of a G sharp. And he uses that really on every other beat, including here. Otherwise, the 4 chord is going through. We have a label of a C augmented chord, but it really is, I think a better explanation is it's just another iteration of the common tone diminished 7 chord all the way through until we get back to the 1 chord here in first inversion. Next, we have a sort of a bold move, a B7 chord. That's a dominant major minor 7 chord. It actually has a flat 9 pitch introduced as an Appoggiatura. Remember, they usually resolve a 5th lower, and that's in fact what it does. So we'll label that as a 5/7 of 3. We're going to call it a 5/4/3 to indicate it's in second inversion of 3. Actually, by here, it's just 5/7 because that's in root position. Instead of a 3 chord, the E minor chord, we have another dominant chord, which should go a 5th lower, which it does. So here we will call that a 5/7 of 6. Again, with an Appoggiatura on the first beat. He introduces the 7th of the chord in the bass here, so we will acknowledge that by saying 5/2 of 6, the designation for a third inversion 7th chord. And then instead of going to the 6th chord, he uses another dominant chord, dominant quality chord, that should be resolving a 5th lower to D. So we'll call that 5/6. Actually, here's the 7th of the chord. At this moment, it's just a triad, so we'll call it a 5/6 of 2. But at that moment, with the 7th introduced, we'll call it a 5/7 of 2. And the last 2 measures of the B section are here. This should have been a D minor chord, but it's a dominant chord again. He's got a string, a chain of secondary dominant chords. This should go a 5th lower, which it does. So we'll say that that's a 5/7 of the 5 chord. And then finally, 5/7 here, with a little inner Appoggiatura here on the A pitch, moving down to the G. Let's take a moment and just review the last 4 or so measures of the B section there. We had a chain of secondary dominant chords. But if you look at the circle of fifths descending, you'll see that if you started on the key, which is the key of C, and then cut across the circle to B, and then follow the circle B, E, A, D, G, and back to C. That actually traces the exact same chords that we just analyzed. So Gershwin is presenting us with an excellent example of a chain of secondary dominant chords that's following the circle of fifths descending. And then we get to start the third iteration of the A section, which is the same harmony that we've already gone over. So for that reason, we'll skip right to the end of the A section. We have a first and a second ending. This is the one chord. Notice the dominant chord. So we have a secondary dominant that we've seen that quite a bit in this piece. But the melody, interestingly, moves up to the A pitch, which is the sixth of the chord. It's an Appoggiatura, resolving to the G. We'll call it 5/7 of 4, moving to the 4 chord. And now this is kind of interesting. Here's my E dominant chord with an augmented fifth. It should resolve a fifth lower. We might want to be tempted to call that a 5 augmented 7 chord of A of 6. But instead it goes to a D minor 7, a bit unusual of a resolution. We'll call this a 2 minor. The melody actually goes up to the ninth of the chord, so this is really a D minor ninth chord. And then we end on the 5 chord here with an augmented fifth. And of course, there's an Appoggiatura here as well on the ninth of the chord. The second ending is very similar, but a few interesting changes. This is the 1 chord, the 5/7 of 4 again, going to 4. But at this moment, we have a 4 chord that's minor. Where does the minor chord come from? So here's the best way to explain that 4 minor chord. As you know, in the key of C, the 4 chord should be major. But if we were in the key of C minor with 3 flats, the 4 chord would in fact be minor. So this is what we call a modal borrowing, or a borrowed chord. So composers like to enhance the palette of harmonies sometimes by taking a chord that normally would be in a minor key and bringing it in and using it in a major key. So that's what we have at the very end of the piece here, which makes for a nice little conclusion, a nice little voice leading from A to A flat to G. And then the piece ends on a 1 chord. Notice the neighbor tone here. And that's the end of this section of the song.